I woke up in that sterile hospital room with the heart monitor beeping like a dying metronome, my chest still aching from the emergency bypass, and the first thing I saw was my oldest son, Derek, standing at the foot of the bed, holding a manila envelope thick enough to choke on. He didn't even wait for the nurse to leave. He just smiled that same entitled smile he'd worn since he was 16 and said I looked tired, that maybe it was time to step back from Bubble Glee before I had another episode. My youngest, Lauren, was already tapping away on her phone in the corner like she was ordering takeout, while my middle child, Ryan, kept glancing at the door as if expecting security. They thought I was still groggy from the anesthesia. They were wrong. I had poured $400,000, every last penny of my late husband's life insurance, into Bubble Glee 3 years earlier, when the kids came to me with their big idea. An app that turned everyday parenting chaos into gamified joy for overwhelmed mums. I entered with nothing but that check and decades of quiet financial discipline from running my own small accounting firm. They entered with big talk and zero skin in the game. Within 18 months, we had 300,000 monthly active users and a Series A term sheet on the table. I kept my founder's shares at 51% voting control because something in my gut, call it the wisdom of a woman who buried her husband at 54, told me to protect myself. They never bothered to read the founder's agreement. Why would they? I was mum, walking ATM, the safe. Now, post-surgery, they were trying to cash me out. Derek slid the papers across the rolling tray. I saw my signature, or what was supposed to be my signature, on an amendment to the irrevocable trust I'd set up 2 years ago. The one that was supposed to protect the company for all of us. This version named them sole beneficiaries and stripped me of any decision-making power, effective immediately. Next to it was a power of attorney form dated 3 weeks earlier, notarized by some guy I'd never met, granting them full authority over my medical and financial decisions. And at the bottom of the stack, a letter from their attorney recommending a guardianship petition based on documented cognitive decline. They had even attached cherry-picked notes from my cardiologist that conveniently omitted the part where he called my recovery prognosis excellent. My stomach didn't drop. It turned to ice. I asked them, voice still raspy from the breathing tube, how long they had been planning this. Lauren didn't even look up from her phone. She just shrugged and said the company was moving too slow under my leadership, that investors wanted fresh blood, and that they had already transferred $1.2 million over the last 26 months into 3 separate LLCs for consulting services. Ryan had the nerve to add that. It was for my own good. I was 62 now. I should be resting, not stressing over burn rate and user retention. They had even lined up a buyer for my lake house. Quiet title action already in motion to transfer it out of my name. I lay there listening to my own children explain why they needed to bury me financially while I was still breathing. The rage didn't explode. It crystallized. I had sacrificed vacations, retirement savings, and every weekend for 3 years, so they could each pull 6-figure salaries from the operating account. Derek as so-called head of growth, Lauren as marketing director, Ryan as product. All while I took a modest $85,000 a year and ploughed the rest back into servers and talent. And now, with me flat on my back in a hospital gown, they were executing the final transfer. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply nodded and told them I needed time to think. They left looking relieved, patting my arm like I was already halfway to the nursing home. The second the door closed, I reached for the tablet the nurse had left and logged into the company bank portal with credentials they didn't know I still controlled. The balances confirmed everything. 1.2 million gone in tidy increments, never more than 48,000 at a time to stay under reporting thresholds. Shell LLCs registered in Delaware and Nevada. Forged board resolutions. Even a new line of credit for $875,000 opened in my name using an old scanned signature from a 2022 document. That was the moment the old me, the one who made excuses for their entitlement, died, right there in that hospital bed. The new me woke up, cold, calculating, and already 3 moves ahead. I spent the next 48 hours pretending to be frail. I let them bring me flowers and tell me how much they loved me, while I quietly activated the forensic accountant I had retained in secret 18 months earlier when I first noticed small discrepancies in the books. I had Ring doorbell footage from the office showing Lauren copying files at 2 a.m. Bank subpoenas were already being prepared. Deleted emails recovered through a third-party service I'd paid for out of my personal account. By the time they wheeled me out of the hospital, I had a binder thick with evidence and a heart that no longer felt broken. It felt forged in something much harder. They thought they had won. They had no idea I still held the 51%. They had no idea the founders' agreement contained a buy-sell clause triggered by any attempt at unauthorized equity dilution. They had no idea I was about to turn their own greed into the weapon that would eviscerate them. I smiled at the discharge nurse, signed the paperwork with a steady hand, and stepped into the car my assistant had waiting. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't driving back to the kids. I was driving toward the war room I had quietly rented 2 floors above our headquarters. The game had changed. They just didn't know it yet. The first week out of the hospital, I played the role they expected. The tired, grateful mother who needed her children's guidance. I let Derek help me into the passenger seat of his leased Audi, listened while Lauren prattled on about how the new branding refresh would finally speak to our audience, and nodded when Ryan suggested we schedule a family meeting to discuss next steps for the company. I even let them move some of my things into the guest room at Derek's oversized McMansion so they could keep an eye on me. They thought the move was about control. For me, it was reconnaissance. Every night after they went to bed, I sat in that sterile guest room with the stale lavender air freshener and opened my laptop under the covers like a teenager hiding from curfew. The forensic accountant, a retired IRS investigator named Marcus Hale I'd hired the year before under a personal consulting agreement, sent encrypted updates through a private portal. He had already pulled the full transaction history on the 3 Delaware LLCs, $1.2 million transferred in 26 separate wires, each disguised as strategic consulting retainers. The invoices were signed by my children themselves. Marcus attached scanned copies with timestamps showing the signatures were applied after hours using the company's own DocuSign account. I didn't rage. I catalogued. The Ring doorbell camera at headquarters, installed for package security but never taken off the cloud backup I controlled, showed Lauren at 1:47 a.m. on 3 separate occasions carrying a portable scanner into my old corner office. Ryan on video, feeding documents into the shredder while Derek stood lookout in the hallway. I saved every clip with metadata intact. My bank had already responded to the initial fraud affidavit I filed the day after discharge. The $875,000 line of credit they opened in my name had been frozen pending investigation, but not before they drew down $420,000. The fraud department promised a full report within 14 business days. I kept my face soft during the day. I let them bring me coffee and tell me how relieved they were that I was finally listening to reason. Lauren even hugged me once, whispering that the guardianship petition was just a precaution, that once the company sold, they would set up a nice annuity for me. I hugged her back and felt nothing but the chill of her perfume, something sharp and expensive that smelled like betrayal bottled. Marcus's next package arrived via courier while the kids were at the office. Yellowed receipts weren't necessary, we had digital ledgers. He had recovered 37 deleted emails from the company's server, using a backup I had quietly enabled 2 years earlier. In one chain, Derek bragged to a potential investor that Mum was checked out, and they would have full control within 90 days. Another from Lauren outlined how they would use the power of attorney to vote my shares out at the next emergency board meeting. Ryan's contribution was a spreadsheet projecting their personal bonuses once my equity was diluted to under 10%. I printed everything on the old inkjet in Derek's home office while they were out. The paper smelled like warm toner and cold justice. I stacked the pages into a plain manila folder and slid it under the mattress each morning. By day 12, I had enough for a temporary restraining order. My new attorney, Elena Vargas, a shark in a navy pantsuit who specialized in founder disputes, met me at a coffee shop 2 towns over. I wore the same grey cardigan they expected me to wear and sipped decaf like a woman whose fight was gone. Elena reviewed the evidence with quiet admiration. She said we had clear grounds for breach of fiduciary duty, conversion of corporate assets, and elder financial abuse. The forged trust amendment alone could trigger criminal referral to the district attorney. She prepared the filings that afternoon. A demand letter, citing the founders' agreement buy-sell clause, notice of intent to audit under Section 220 of the Delaware General Corporation Law, and a petition for emergency asset freeze. I signed every page with a hand that no longer trembled. Back at the house, I continued the performance. When Derek asked why I was so quiet, I told him I was just processing everything, that maybe they were right about stepping back. Ryan beamed like he'd won the lottery. Lauren started talking about listing the lake house again, saying the buyer was still interested even with the clouded title. I nodded and asked her to pass the mashed potatoes. Inside, the old walking ATM was gone. In her place sat a woman counting down the hours until the paperwork dropped. Marcus confirmed the Shell LLCs had no real operations, just pass-through accounts feeding directly into personal checking for each of my children. Over the 26 months, they had each pulled an extra $400,000 on top of their already generous salaries. My company, the one I seeded with my husband's death benefit, had become their personal slush fund. I spent one more night in that lavender-scented guest room, listening to the security system beep every time one of them came home late. The red light on the Ring camera in the hallway caught Lauren sneaking into my room at 2:12 a.m. to check my laptop. She found nothing. I had wiped the browser history and moved the real files to an encrypted drive in my purse. She left satisfied, never noticing the tiny motion sensor I had placed on the drawer. The next morning, I told them I wanted to visit the office one last time to say goodbye to the team. They exchanged glances but agreed. They thought it was closure. I knew it was the staging ground. Elena had the process server on standby. The bank subpoenas were queued. The SEC Form 8K draft sat in my drafts folder, ready to disclose the internal control failures. I rode in the back seat of Derek's car watching the city blur past, feeling the weight of the USB drive in my pocket like a loaded chamber. They still thought I was the mother they could bury. I was about to show them I was the founder who would bury them instead. I rode to the office that morning in the back of Derek's Audi wearing the same faded cardigan they associated with weakness, my hands folded in my lap like a woman who had already surrendered. They chatted in the front seat about quarterly projections and how the new investor deck needed to highlight fresh leadership. I stared out the window and let them believe every word. The USB drive in my purse felt heavier than any contract I had ever signed. At headquarters, they ushered me through the glass doors like visiting royalty who was about to abdicate. The open-plan floor buzzed with the usual energy. Developers at standing desks, marketing running A/B tests on the big screens. But the air tasted different now. Stale ambition mixed with the faint, metallic tang of impending collapse. Lauren guided me to the glass conference room where my nameplate had already been removed from the door. Ryan pulled out my old chair at the head of the table, as if doing me a favor. I sat. I listened. I performed. Derek launched into a 30-minute presentation about streamlining governance, while Lauren nodded along, and Ryan kept checking his watch. They laid out a proposed board resolution that would vote my 51% down to advisory status only. They even had a revised cap table ready, showing my equity diluted to 9.8% through a new round they claimed was already committed. I let my shoulders slump. I rubbed my chest where the surgery scar still pulled and asked in a small voice if this meant I could finally rest. Their relief was almost pathetic. Derek patted my hand and said they had a nice condo picked out near the lake house, once the title cleared, of course. While they talked, I memorized every face in the room. 3 outside investors sat on the far side of the table, expensive watches glinting under the recessed lights. They had no idea they were being sold a company built on forged documents and stolen seed money. I made mental notes of their names from the name tents. Later that night, Marcus would run background checks and flag any red flags I could use. After the meeting, Lauren suggested I rest in my old office while they handled the heavy lifting. I agreed and closed the door behind me. The moment the lock clicked, I dropped the frail act. I pulled the encrypted drive from my purse, plugged it into the desktop I still had admin rights on, and uploaded the full forensic package to a secure cloud folder Elena had set up. Then I triggered the silent audit script Marcus had installed months earlier. It pulled every transaction since incorporation without leaving a log trace. I spent 40 quiet minutes in that office photographing the new org chart on the whiteboard and the stack of pre-signed board resolutions sitting on the credenza. The red blinking light of the Ring camera in the corner caught it all. My own silent witness. When Lauren knocked to check on me, I was back in character, staring blankly at a framed photo of the 4 of us from launch day. She bought it completely. That evening at Derek's house, I continued the theatre. I let them pour me a half glass of the cheap Pinot they thought I liked, and listened while they celebrated getting Mum on board. Ryan even joked that once the guardianship was approved, they could move me into assisted living with round-the-clock care. I smiled weakly and asked for another blanket. Inside, the cold calculus ran non-stop. Elena had filed the temporary restraining order petition that afternoon under seal. The court clerk confirmed it would be heard in 48 hours. The demand letter citing the buy-sell clause and demanding immediate repayment of the $1.2 million in diverted funds was couriered to their personal addresses with proof of service. I waited until midnight, when the house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional beep of the security system arming. From the guest room, I logged into the company portal one last time and activated the clause in the founders' agreement that froze all major expenditures pending a majority vote. The system logged it under my credentials. By morning, the kids would wake up to alerts that payroll for the entire team was on hold, and vendor contracts were flagged for review. Marcus sent his latest encrypted brief at 1:30 a.m. The Shell LLCs had been feeding personal Venmo and Zelle accounts. Lauren had bought a new luxury SUV with company funds routed through her LLC. Derek had paid off his second mortgage. Ryan had quietly moved $60,000 into a crypto exchange before the first freeze hit. Every transaction carried timestamps and IP addresses linking back to company devices. I saved the file, powered down the laptop, and lay in the dark listening to the stale perfume on the guest room blanket. No rage, only the clean satisfaction of pieces sliding into place. The next day, I told them I wanted to attend the emergency board meeting they had scheduled for that afternoon. They hesitated but agreed, probably thinking my presence would make the vote look legitimate. I rode with them again, still playing the exhausted mother. When we walked into the conference room, the 3 outside investors were already seated, looking impatient. Derek started the meeting by announcing my voluntary transition to advisor. That was my cue. I stood slowly, reached into my purse, and placed a single manila envelope on the polished table. No theatrics, just the soft crinkle of legal paper against wood. Inside were the first 20 pages, the forensic summary, the forged POA highlighted in yellow, screenshots of the unauthorized transfers, and the court-stamped copy of the temporary restraining order that had been granted at 9:17 that morning. Elena had worked fast. The order froze all Bubble Glee accounts, prohibited any further equity changes, and barred my children from company premises pending full audit. The process server stepped in right behind me, quiet, professional, and carrying copies for each of them. Derek's face went the colour of old oatmeal. Lauren's phone clattered to the table. Ryan tried to bluster something about me being confused from the medication. I simply looked at the investors and said, in the clearest voice they had heard from me in weeks, that I still held 51% voting control, and that any attempt to dilute it would trigger immediate legal action, plus SEC disclosure. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. One of the investors, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, picked up the papers and started reading. I watched my children realize in real time that the walking ATM had just become the foreclosure notice. I didn't smile. Not yet. But as the security guards, called in under the new restraining language, escorted Derek, Lauren, and Ryan toward the elevators, I felt the first clean breath I had taken since waking up in that hospital bed. The setup was complete. The leverage was mine. Now came the part where their world came apart, piece by documented piece. The investors didn't leave. They leaned in, reading the highlighted sections of the restraining order while my children stood frozen near the elevator banks, security guards flanking them like they were already defendants. Derek tried one last power move, stepping forward and telling the room this was all a misunderstanding, that Mum was still recovering and her judgment was impaired. The lead investor, the woman with the sharp eyes, simply raised one perfectly arched brow and asked him to explain the $1.2 million in undocumented transfers. He had no answer. I remained standing at the head of the table, the manila envelope now joined by a second, thicker binder Elena had couriered over during the meeting. Inside were the full forensic audit summary, sworn affidavits from Marcus Hale, bank statements showing every diverted dollar, and a formal notice invoking the buy-sell clause of the founders' agreement. Under its terms, their attempted dilution triggered my right to purchase their combined 49% at a valuation set by an independent appraiser, using the last clean financials before their theft began. That number came in at roughly $2.8 million. They would receive a fraction of that after offsets for the stolen funds. Elena walked in at that exact moment, navy suit impeccable, heels clicking like a countdown. She introduced herself as my counsel and handed each of my children a fresh set of documents. 30-day demand for repayment of the $1.2 million plus interest at the statutory rate. Notice of intent to file criminal referral for wire fraud and forgery, and preliminary notices of eviction from the company leased vehicles and the lake house they had fraudulently transferred. The quiet title action to reclaim the lake house had already been filed that morning. Lauren's voice cracked as she asked how I could do this to my own blood. I looked at her steadily and told her blood had nothing to do with forging my signature while I was unconscious in recovery. Ryan started pacing, muttering about lawsuits of his own. Derek just stared at the restraining order like it was written in a language he no longer understood. The investors excused themselves politely, saying they would await clarification on the company's governance before proceeding with any term sheet. One of them actually shook my hand on the way out and thanked me for the transparency. That was when the real unraveling began. Within 48 hours, the frozen accounts meant payroll alerts went out to the entire team. I personally emailed every employee, explaining the temporary hold was due to an internal control failure under investigation, and that I would personally guarantee their next paycheck from my own line of credit once the court released partial funds. Morale didn't collapse. It realigned behind me. Several senior developers sent private replies saying they had suspected something was off when the kids started driving new cars while server costs were being questioned. Marcus's team worked around the clock. By day 4, we had traced the $875,000 fraudulent line of credit straight to personal expenditures. Derek's mortgage payoff, Lauren's SUV lease buyout, Ryan's down payment on a vacation condo in the mountains. The forensic report read like a ledger of greed. I forwarded it to the district attorney's office with a cover letter from Elena, citing elder financial abuse statutes in our state. The kids didn't go quietly. They showed up at Derek's house that evening, my temporary residence, demanding I drop everything. I met them in the living room with the security system already recording. Lauren tried love-bombing first, tears and all, saying they only wanted what was best for the family. Ryan shifted to threats, claiming they had dirt on my erratic behavior for the guardianship petition. Derek just stood there calculating angles like the head of growth he pretended to be. I let them finish. Then I slid a fresh manila envelope across the coffee table. Inside, copies of the criminal referral already submitted, the asset freeze extending to their personal accounts tied to the LLCs, and a copy of the temporary restraining order that now included a no-contact provision barring them from approaching me or any Bubble Glee property. The judge had signed it after reviewing the ring footage and hospital records. They left that night with their tails between their legs, but not before Lauren screamed that I would die alone. I watched the red blinking light of the doorbell camera capture every word as the door closed behind them. No flinch, no second thoughts, only the clean snap of boundaries locking into place. The following week, the cascade accelerated. The lake house buyer backed out once the Liz pendants hit the title report. The bank reversed the fraudulent line of credit draws and began clawing back what it could from the kids' accounts. SEC staff contacted our general counsel after the draft 8K was filed, triggering mandatory disclosures that tanked any remaining investor interest in the old structure. I called an all-hands meeting and announced that I was exercising the buy-sell clause. Their shares were now mine at the discounted valuation. The company would survive, leaner, cleaner, and under adult supervision again. Derek tried one final Hail Mary. He showed up at the office parking garage despite the restraining order, begging for a family meeting. Security escorted him off the property. The police report added another layer to the file. By the end of week 3, I sat in the same conference room, alone this time, reviewing the settlement proposal Elena had drafted. My children would relinquish all claims, repay $650,000 immediately from liquidated personal assets, and sign ironclad releases. In return, I would not pursue full criminal charges. Yet. The choice was theirs. I signed the cover letter with the same steady hand that had built this company from a battered laptop and a widow's check. Then I leaned back in the chair that still bore my nameplate and allowed myself one small, private exhale. The takedown wasn't loud, it was surgical. Paper by paper, account by frozen account, they watched the empire they tried to steal collapse back into my hands. And somewhere in the distance, the CEO whose heart I would eventually claim was already watching the whole thing unfold with quiet admiration. But that part of the story still waited in the wings. For now, the only sound that mattered was the soft click of the final manila envelope sealing their ruin. The settlement offer sat on the conference table like a loaded gun with the safety off. Eleanor had structured it with surgical precision. $650,000 in immediate restitution wired from their personal accounts, full relinquishment of any claims to Bubble Glee equity or the lake house, and binding non-disparagement clauses backed by liquidated damages of $250,000 per breach. In exchange, I would hold the criminal referrals in abeyance for 12 months. No hugs, no tears, just ink and iron. They signed 3 days later in a neutral mediator's office downtown, their faces drawn and eyes avoiding mine. Derek's hand shook as he pushed the papers back across the table. Lauren's designer bag looked suddenly shabby under the fluorescent lights. Ryan kept muttering about how this would ruin their futures. I simply initialed each page with the same pen I had used to sign the original incorporation documents 4 years earlier, and slid them back without a word. The mediator witnessed everything. The moment the last signature dried, Eleanor filed the stipulations with the court and triggered the asset releases. That was when the cascade truly began. The bank unfroze just enough operating capital for me to make payroll and stabilize the servers, but the personal accounts tied to the shell LLCs remained locked. Within 48 hours, the first eviction notices went out. Derek's leased Audi, purchased with diverted consulting fees, had its repo crew arrive at his McMansion driveway at 6:15 a.m. The neighbor's security light caught the whole thing. 2 uniformed men hooking up the car, while Derek stood on the porch in boxers, yelling that it was a mistake. Lauren's luxury SUV was next. The finance company repossessed it from her apartment complex parking spot after the fraudulent lease buyout was reversed. Ryan's mountain condo down payment was clawed back, triggering a notice of default on his mortgage. The lender sent process servers to his door with a 30-day pay or quit letter. I didn't watch the videos live. Marcus forwarded the clips from public records and neighbor cameras. I reviewed them once, in the quiet of my new temporary apartment 2 blocks from headquarters, and felt nothing but the clean satisfaction of accounts balancing. The stale perfume of their entitlement was finally being aired out. Public filings did the rest. The SEC 8K went live at market open the following Monday, detailing material weaknesses in internal controls, related party transactions under investigation, and the temporary leadership transition. Bubble Glee's valuation took an immediate 32% haircut on paper, but the core product and user base remained intact. Headhunters started calling me directly. Talent that had quietly updated their resumes under the kids regime now flooded back with loyalty offers. I promoted 2 senior women who had kept the app alive during the chaos and gave them meaningful equity. Real equity this time, documented in a new irrevocable trust with me as sole trustee until vesting milestones. the lake house reclamation hit its final stage. The quiet title action cleared the fraudulent deed transfer. Court-appointed appraisers valued it at $1.4 million. I listed it the same week, with instructions to sell fast. The closing would fund the last tranche of restitution. On moving day, I hired a crew to box up every last item my children had left there. Ski gear, framed photos of their entitled vacations, even the custom wine fridge Derek had installed with company funds. The crew loaded it all into a storage pod I paid for personally. I kept nothing. The new owners, a retired couple from the Midwest, closed escrow 47 days later. I wired the net proceeds straight into Bubble Glee's operating account as founder capital. My children tried one last coordinated assault through their attorney. They filed an emergency motion to vacate the restraining order, claiming duress and diminished capacity on my part. The judge reviewed the full forensic binder, the ring footage timestamps, and the hospital records showing I had signed nothing while under sedation. Motion denied in open court. The Flying Monkeys, mutual friends who had received their sob stories, received polite cease-and-desist letters from Elena warning of defamation exposure. Most went silent. A few actually reached out to me privately to apologize for ever doubting the woman who built the company. Through it all, one person watched the entire storm with calm interest. Alexander Kane, the turnaround CEO a major venture firm had quietly brought in as a board observer weeks before the explosion. He had sat in the back of that fateful board meeting, saying almost nothing while the papers dropped. Tall, silver at the temples, with the kind of quiet authority that came from having rescued 3 unicorns from the brink. After the dust settled, he requested a private meeting in the same glass conference room. I expected another investor pitch or exit discussion. Instead, he reviewed the clean financials I had prepared, asked precise questions about user retention metrics, and then closed the folder. He looked at me across the table and said the company needed steady hands more than flashy growth hacks, and that he would step in as CEO if I retained majority control and stayed as executive chair. No golden parachute demands, no equity grab. Just a proposal built on respect for the founder who had refused to be erased. I accepted on the spot. The board ratified it unanimously the following week. Alexander moved into the corner office with the big windows, but he spent most evenings in mine, going over strategy decks with 2 coffees and 0 drama. His steady presence felt like the first safe harbor I had known since my husband died. No love bombing, no manipulation. Just 2 adults who had both survived corporate knife fights and recognized a worthy partner when they saw one. 6 months after the hospital wake-up call, I sat at the closing table for the lake house sale with a cashier's check for $980,000 in my personal account after all offsets and legal fees. Bubble Glee had stabilized. My children had been forced to sell cars, downsize homes, and watch their credit scores crater under the public judgments. They no longer existed in my life. No holiday texts, no tentative olive branches. The boundaries were steel reinforced and final. I walked out of escrow with the check, met Alexander for dinner that night, and let myself feel the weight of everything I had reclaimed. $1 million in liquid assets between the restitution, the house sale, and the restructured founder equity, and beside me, the man whose quiet strength had become the unexpected heartbeat in the new chapter. The walking ATM was dead. The founder who refused to die was very much alive, richer in every sense that mattered, and finally, unapologetically, free. The final manila envelope slid across the mahogany conference table with a soft, decisive crinkle that sounded like the closing of a vault. Inside were the last pieces, the recorded judgment liens against each of my children's remaining assets, the full release of all claims they had signed under penalty of perjury, and the irrevocable severance of any future contact. Alexander Kane sat to my right, executive chair title now mine alone, reviewing the documents with the same quiet precision he brought to every turnaround. No gloating, just the calm satisfaction of numbers that finally balanced. 6 months had passed since the boardroom ambush, and Bubble Glee had clawed its way back to stability. Monthly active users climbed past 400,000. Revenue stabilized at $2.1 million per month. The new leadership team I handpicked operated with clean books and zero tolerance for the old games. Alexander had taken the CEO role exactly as proposed. Steady hands, no equity grab, just a performance-based package tied to milestones we both believed in. His presence in the office had become the quiet rhythm I looked forward to each morning. The low murmur of his voice on strategy calls, the faint scent of his black coffee beside mine on the side table, the way he listened when I spoke about product vision, without ever interrupting to mansplain. But today wasn't about the company. Today was the final severance. Derek, Lauren, and Ryan sat on the opposite side of the table with their court-appointed attorney, faces pale under the recessed lighting. They had aged in the short time since the takedown. Derek's McMansion was now listed in a short sale. Lauren's social media presence had gone dark after the public filings tanked her influencer side gigs. Ryan had defaulted on the mounting condo and moved into a one-bedroom rental with court-ordered wage garnishment already in place. The district attorney had declined full criminal prosecution after the restitution was wired, $650,000 plus interest, but the civil judgments remained. They would wear those numbers for years. Their attorney slid the signed originals back to Eleanor. She reviewed each page methodically, then nodded once. I signed the final acceptance with the same pen from Incorporation Day. No speeches, no closure conversation. I simply looked at each of them in turn and stated that any attempt to contact me, approach my residence, or interfere with Bubble Glee would trigger immediate enforcement of the permanent restraining order and the liquidated damages clause. The words landed like hammer strikes on concrete. Lauren tried one last time. She whispered that they were still family, that blood had to count for something after everything. I met her eyes without flinching and replied that blood had stopped counting the moment they forged my signature in a hospital recovery room and tried to bury me for $1.2 million. Derek stared at the table. Ryan's jaw worked but produced no sound. The flying monkeys had long since scattered. The narcissistic web they had spun around me for 3 years lay in documented shreds across 3 separate court dockets. Elena collected the final set and filed them electronically from her tablet, right there in the room. The moment the confirmation pinged, the lake house proceeds cleared into my personal account, pushing my total liquid recovery past $1,100,000 after all fees and offsets. The company itself was now valued internally at $8.4 million post-cleanup, with my majority stake intact and protected by a new voting trust no one could touch. I stood first. Alexander rose beside me, his hand brushing mine in a gesture so natural it needed no explanation. We walked out together while security escorted my former children to the service elevator. The red blinking light of the ring camera in the lobby caught their departure, the same system that had documented their midnight document raids months earlier. I didn't look back. The stale perfume of entitlement that once clung to every family gathering was finally gone, replaced by the clean scent of fresh paint in the rebranded executive wing. That evening, Alexandra and I sat on the balcony of the new downtown loft I had purchased with part of the restitution funds. No more guest rooms that smelled of lavender manipulation. Just open space, city lights, and two adults who had both survived their own versions of corporate and personal betrayal. He poured a measured glass of bourbon for each of us and raised it without ceremony. We had spent the last months building something real on top of the wreckage. Strategy sessions that stretched into dinners, shared silences that felt like trust. The slow realization that his heart had room for a founder who refused to be erased. There were no grand declarations, just the steady knowledge that this was earned, not stolen. I slept that night without the old weight on my chest. The heart monitor beeps from the hospital room felt like another lifetime. In their place was the soft hum of the building's security system arming itself, and the knowledge that every boundary was now steel-reinforced by court order and personal choice. My children no longer existed in my world. No tentative texts on birthdays, no holiday guilt. The irrevocable trust I redrafted named only the company, key employees with vested incentives, and a small scholarship fund for single parents entering tech. People who would never treat opportunity like an inheritance to loot. The walking ATM was dead and buried. In her place stood a 63-year-old founder with majority control, a $1 million cushion, and a CEO whose quiet respect had quietly become something deeper and more solid than any family tie ever was. Justice hadn't come with tears or reunion hugs. It arrived in manila envelopes, frozen accounts, eviction notices, and the clean finality of a courtroom stamp. I had entered Glee with nothing but grief money and quiet discipline. I walked forward with everything that mattered. Control, freedom, and a future written on my own terms. The door to the past clicked shut for the last time. I never opened it again.